Hello everyone, can you hear me? I know you can't see me yet. Awesome. Yeah, sorry, I had a little nervous moment there because YouTube was giving me some problems, but I think we're going now. Awesome. So it's so great of you all to join me here today. There's just way more people watching me right now than I'm used to when I'm streaming. So before we begin, just say hello to all of you, and I know some of you certainly, and a lot of you I've also just instead seen around the internet, or some of you are new, which is pretty awesome. It's just a little moment of community that we're building here. So thanks for saying hi in the chat. Please feel free to keep up some banter there, ask some questions as we go along, or answer other people's questions, or what have you. Hi, Nick. Good to see you there. It's actually 11 o'clock. I was going to start a little bit earlier, but since I ran into some problems, my pre-stream banter is going to be cut short. So yeah, let's get started. So my name is Daniel Huffman, and I am a freelance cartographer in Madison, Wisconsin. And if you want to know more about me, you can visit my website at somethingaboutmaps.com, or follow me on Twitter, or check out my other live streams that I've done in the past. This is my 6th one, I want to say. And so there's a link, right here if you're interested in heading over to my YouTube page and catching those. Also looks like I'm live right now. That's pretty great. So my topic today is the fundamentals of label placement. And this is something that I cover extensively when I teach cartography courses from time to time at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I actually spend about 4 hours roughly of class time talking about labeling. It's something I'm a big fan of. It's my favorite part of cartography. And I'm just going to give you an abbreviated version of some of that material here today. And this is going to be basic to some of you who might have covered this already, but I think there's a value in covering the basics more than one time. Not only because it's useful to see how other people think of things that maybe we learned a long time ago and take for granted, but also it's good to have some refreshers. We don't all remember everything that we learned in our classes, which I can attest to both as a student and an instructor. So it's definitely nice to kind of get a refresher from time to time. So yeah, let's jump in and talk about how labels work and sort of the fundamental way that I think about them. We're trying to talk about in labeling what things are called. And the way that labels function, in my mind, has to do with building geometric relationships, or visual relationships, you might say, between the label and the thing you're labeling. So I can tell that the Baltic Sea is this body of water because there's the words Baltic Sea flowing right through that area of water, so that's probably associated with that area somehow. Or I can see, over here we've got, Vilnius near that star, so that spatial relationship between the two suggests that's probably Vilnius, or that this is Łódź, which I'm not good at pronouncing Polish names, but I think that's roughly how it's pronounced. So that's kind of the underpinning theory behind the way that I think about labels. How do we establish a visual and geometric relationship between these things? And proximity is one part of it, but you're going to see some other things as we go along. So let's start with the basics. Let's start with point features. And the typical advice that I would give my students, this is kind of a slide that I would show them, is to say, well, if we got a point feature, a city, a mine, or or a building or something like that, in my mind, the best way to place that label is what we might call, awkwardly, in the corner of that point feature. Sort of offset up or down and to the right or left. And I think the second best option, if you can't do something like that, because as we'll see, reality ensues in mapping situations, is to go centered above or below. And then I have a couple of examples of things that I would consider less than good options, like directly off to the right or left, or this off-center thing. So the question is why? Why? This is kind of the advice that I was given when I was a student, but no one ever said why this is good and why this is second best and why this is not as good. And so what I want to do through this presentation is try and give you some rationale behind it. And you can agree with it or not, but at least you'll have some understanding of how I think about it that you can then build off of for your own sort of theories of good labeling. Yeah, I see the Philadelphia point has you bothered. We're gonna cover that, and at least why I think that is happening. So first off, this idea about why might something like this, like Shanghai here or Alcatraz, be not quite as good as these off into the up and down and to the right or left, these almost flag positions. And to me, that has to do with the idea that we want to create a strong relationship between the label and the point, but we also want to not interfere with legibility. And if I were, for example, to try and read Shanghai, my brain has to take a moment to take this chunk of ink, as it were, ink in quotation marks because we're pixels, and separate them and determine some of these are glyphs, right? Some of these are parts of labels, and one thing is not a letter. And so it's kind of like separating these into two chunks here. That chunk and that chunk. And that's not like a huge lift for our brain to do, but it's a little bit more cognitive work than seeing this thing here as separate from this thing, because there's a little bit more distancing between them. And I think that just makes the whole thing a little bit more elegant and a little bit clearer to read. Again, it's not like a make or break thing for your map by any means, but it's a small thing. So that's kind of why I go for that position. It's a strong relationship still. These things are very clearly associated with each other, but they're not quite as separated as easily as it is up here in the pretty good options. And the kind of okay, that centering has some separation, but not quite as much as the corner positions. So that's why I rank them like that. As for Philadelphia, that's off center, and that bothers me too, because our eye and brain system of processing data didn't evolve to look at graphics. Right? Thousands of years ago, we were looking out there at the forest and the savannah or what have you, and we were looking to see if that tree is going to fall over, or if that rock is going to fall off the cliff, or what have you. We're used to unconsciously assigning weight to things that nowadays don't physically have any weight. This is just graphics on a screen. But this thing to me looks unbalanced, like it's going to suddenly tip over, right? It's just going to plop over like that. And so it feels awkward when it's just kind of hovering there, waiting for something to happen. And so this is what, when I talk about concepts of weight and balance in graphics, I'm usually thinking those kind of terms. And another non-map example, or not a non-label example rather for you, has to do with this poster that I made a few years ago. I arranged all these islands in the Great Lakes system on the page, but originally when I was designing this thing, I thought about arranging them the other way. And then I realized that would look really unbalanced. Right now there's this big island here, Manitoulin Island, sitting at the bottom of the page. It looks kind of stable, but just as a quick test, if I flip this thing 180 degrees over, that looks really awkward. Like it looks like it's going to collapse down and all this heavy stuff on top is going to fall. So this is a real phenomenon, I think, that affects a lot of us in the back of our brains. We're assigning weight to things. And so Philadelphia kind of looks like it's sitting on this point and it's going to tip over. So that's my rationale behind it. Now, when I was a student, I was given a guide like this about label positions. And maybe you've seen things like this before. I've seen them published in journals, and I think like Edward Imhoff has something like this, where there's actually a rank order, like best position through number 8 position. And again, this was given to me without any rationale behind it. So what I just explained to you a minute ago is kind of my attempt to rationalize and understand it. And even this rank order that I pulled from some materials given to me as a student disagrees a little bit with what I just told you, because your mileage could vary here. A lot of people in these systems, though, tend to still rank those corner positions as best. And honestly, I don't think this number 1 is any better than this 2 or 3 or 4, the way that I think about it. They're all nicely offset, clearly connected, while still separable. I think they're all the same to me, the way that I practice labeling. And then in this person's labeling hierarchy, they gave, the left and right options. They ranked that a little bit higher than the top and the bottom. And I wouldn't, but I wanted to show this as kind of a counterexample, that people rank these differently, and hopefully with the explanation that I'm giving you, you can kind of build your own idea of what's good and what's not. Regardless of where you put these things, to me, one of the most important things to pay attention to is spacing. And people, students will ask me, like, how far is too far from the dot, or how close is too close? And I don't have a good metric for that. It's just sort of, well, I don't want it to be so far that it's unclear, and I don't want it to be so close that it looks like the dot is going to run into the label, like it's a little bit claustrophobic almost. So that's a little bit of a trial and error thing. But what I will say is that consistency in spacing, I think, is important, whatever you pick. And these are pretty inconsistent right now. And to me, that's a problem for a couple of reasons. It looks really haphazard, and I think that can undermine confidence in your map. So if I'm a map reader and I see these things are all kind of scattered around, different distances, different placements, I might, as a map reader, think, well, you were kind of sloppy with this and haphazard. It makes me doubt other stuff on your map. Maybe if I'm looking at your data on, I don't know, traffic jams or, poverty rates or some other data set that I am not an expert in, then I'm gonna say, well, I saw you were kind of sloppy with the labels. Were you sloppy with these other things that I couldn't tell when you were processing the data? So I think that's one important thing to think about in the importance of consistency. And the other thing is, I think that we form a compact with our reader when we put a map before them. We're asking them to spend time reading something that we've put together, and I think we owe it to them to mind the details, to show them that we're acting with intent and purpose, and that everything we put before them has a reason for being that way. Because that's something we've all experienced as map readers too, when we can tell when something has a lot of thought behind it or when it doesn't. And it's much more satisfying, and as a reader I feel more respected when I see something where somebody has paid attention to those fine details. And labeling is a place with a lot of details, and so even something as simple as controlling your spacing can make a difference. And I'll just show you a real quick way to do this fast. I could eyeball these. I could move these things around real quick, but what I often do is I'm just going to select all these dots instead and say, let's just give them a quick stroke. That's yellow, and this is going to be huge for print purposes because I set this up as slides. And now, with that stroke around them, just nudge these things right next to the dots. And now I'm going to get, when I take those strokes away, I'm going to have even spacing. And we're done. So now I just pull that back off. And done. So just a little quick tip about how to get that done. It doesn't take too much to do. So a question has come in. Would I say that somebody's native reading direction, right to left, left to right, informs those aesthetics? That is entirely possible. I'm not really sure of anybody who's done research on these things, and it sounds like the sort of thing some cartographer in academia might do research on. And so maybe if one of you knows of a paper out there and you want to paste that into the chat or tweet about it later or something like that, I'd be curious to read more about it. I'm definitely operating from this, I speak English, I operate in Latin characters too. Certainly, I've labeled maps in Chinese and Arabic. I don't really know those languages. People have given me sort of Word documents with the labels to go on, and that probably affects things as well. But at least in the context of the Anglophone world and those that use Latin characters, I think a lot of this kind of makes sense to me. But it's a very good thing to think about. So, and also, so many of you are also saying hi from all of the different places you're coming from, and this is really great. Like, we have people from Russia and Canada, let's see, California, New York. I don't know if I mentioned, I'm in Madison, Wisconsin. So I also vaguely planned this event around Central Time Zone being really convenient to me. So for those of you who are not in this time zone, thanks for showing up. So, what was I going to say? I was going to talk more. One more thing about point labels, too. A common piece of advice you see about how they interact with point features. You want to keep these labels on the same side of the line as your point features. So on the left side here, Moskva or Adelaide, separated by this river from their dot, that's not as good as like Luanda or Detroit over here. And the reason for that is, again, we want to create a strong visual relationship, and that line interrupts it. It's not terrible. It's not like somebody is going to look at this map and get completely confused about what they're looking at and what goes with what. But that's not entirely the point. It's a small thing, and certainly if this were a more detailed map, that could be a problem. But it's just, we want to strengthen that relationship as much as we can, and it takes just as much effort to place the label on one side of the dot as it does the other, so you might as well do it right, as it were. this is something that comes up a lot in cartography, I think. I point out to students, sometimes it takes just as much effort to do the thing that's great as it does to do the thing that's almost good. So even though the almost as good thing is fine, you might as well do the great one. Didn't take you anything. So that's my advice on these kind of smaller situations that you see in labeling guides that say, put this in the coast or put this on one side of the line or the other. It's worth the effort because it doesn't take any extra. So that brings us to line features. And this one is an audience participation question, because I usually ask my students in class a lot to think about how they would change things in my slides. I give them different examples, and this is a not well labeled map of line features. And so I want you to suggest some ways that we might improve that, and then we'll use that as a springboard to talk about some ways to improve our line features. And while you think about this, and while you type your options for improvement in the chat, I'll just tell you the general theory here that I think about with labeling line features. And I noticed my bitrate has dropped a little bit. It's raining here, and sometimes that gets my internet connection a little weak. So hopefully it's not too fuzzy or bad for you, but let me know in the chat if that's going on. The Tequemanon River here, notice how it kind of follows the shape of the river, and that's kind of what we want to do with line features. Rivers, roads, railroads, things like that. That's what we want to do as our general rule, because that's a geometric relationship between the line and the feature and the label feature that goes with it. All right, so I'm getting some good answers here. Po River looks upside down. Absolutely. So that's the first one. So once we know this general idea of let's label things along lines, there's some better ones than I'm doing here. Po River's upside down. I can just flip that over. That'll be fine. We don't want people to have to go like this to read the map. That's going to be making it unnecessarily difficult. And if you've got a paper map, maybe someone can rotate it over, but let's not make that happen. Next up, I see that people are talking about the Zambezi River. Yes, it is not doing... Let's make it so it doesn't do contortions. Absolutely. So we want to follow the general shape of the river, but we don't want to go crazy. We don't want to, we don't want to go... It says my video is... Oh no, losing video here. Oh, okay, well, it says it's good. All right, well, people say it's fine. All right, but my screen, my preview says there's nothing happening, so that's encouraging. Okay, great. If not, well, then, you go get a sandwich or watch somebody else. That's my philosophy on today if something goes wrong. In any case, all right, great. So the Zambezi River, yeah, we want to follow the river. We don't want to go crazy because, and this is the thing about rivers, there's a lot of bumps, there's a lot of ups and downs, and we're going to follow roughly the general shape as best we can. That's the idea here. So actually, I'm just going to relabel the Zambezi. I'm just going to steal this curve here. There's a trade-off. There's a in here between how closely we follow the feature and how difficult the label is to read, because text is not really planned to go on curves specifically. And so, the B is weirdly angled relative to the M, and I know that's hurting some of you. You mentioned in the stream. So I'm just going to kind of get like this. And this doesn't fit everything perfectly, but it's a nice between the river goes roughly this way. Think about if you generalized this stream, if you zoomed way out, how smooth you would make it. Make the river kind of follow that. So there, that's a little bit better. I would say. And again, there's no perfect position. I would say that, the secret is nobody likes labeling rivers. It's really hard. It works perfectly. And if you've seen me label things before, you'll know I obsess about tweak this curve here, get this just right. But, after a while, you just got to throw in the towel. So let's see. I'm just going to scroll back in the chat here and see other comments people had. The Tequemanon River. Yeah, it's too far. Definitely want to get that a little bit closer on here. And this is another one that kind of follows the shape, but is not exact. It's the best we can do, definitely. So, that doesn't follow every bend here. I saw somebody say to put the Colville River up here, and I wasn't sure if people would point this one out. This is something that I don't hear said as often. My advisor used to say, and I would say, he said it one time, as far as I recall, Mark Harrower, in my intro cartography class. My advisor would say, labels are not bats. They don't hang from things. And I used to wonder why he would say that. He would say, put this thing on top of the river, don't dangle it under the river. And what I've realized over time is it has to do with spacing. Consistent spacing between the river, or whatever line feature you're doing, and the label. Notice how there's an even amount, roughly, of white space here. There's a bump in the river, but it's pretty close. That's a little bit better than when this thing was down here. I'll just make a copy so you can see here. Now there's a lot of unevenness in the white space because they're ascenders. And there's capital letters, right? There's parts of the text that are bigger or smaller. So this is just not quite as even. The relationship is not as strong between the river and the thing that's labeling the river. It's a small thing, and it's important to understand this is not an absolute rule. I don't believe there are rules of any sort in cartography. But it's important to kind of understand the philosophy behind it, because we want to break it sometimes, depending on the shape of our label. Right? Here, this thing has one descender, and so it's breaking our consistency a little bit, but it would be worse if it were down here. There's all these, ascenders in the H and the T, etc. So it's probably better on top, but there might be label situations based on what you're spelling out where putting it underneath and hanging down actually leads to more consistent spacing. So don't take this as an absolute. Understand why this is being said. Absolutely. The Anadir River has a giant space between the two words. Yes, a couple of you were talking about the Anadir, and I would say too that the besides that too, and I didn't see if one of you mentioned it because there's a lot of you chatting, many more than I anticipated. So I might miss what you say sometimes. This thing is sitting on top of the road. It'd be nice if this whole thing were more consistently spaced to the river. This is just like, getting things like in the dot example, like something interposing itself in that relationship, and we don't want that. So I would probably instead, just going to zoom in here and say, let's put this thing underneath, and maybe abbreviate river, and not overset that. I typed that before the apostrophe, so that we're not splitting this up into two words, one of which is on a road and one of which isn't. And this is kind of getting close to upside down, but sometimes we have to deal with unideal situations in labeling, unfortunately. So I'd probably go with something like that. And several of you are talking about abbreviating river, or just not even saying river, and I do that too. I was showing river as examples here for clarity, since these are like made up geographies I'm throwing together, but I said before, nobody likes labeling rivers. It's hard to fit curves and find the spot. And, if you don't say the entire word river, that's a lot easier. If the shorter you can make this label, the easier it is. I have clients push back sometimes. They really want to know that it's such and such river, and sometimes I can get away with the abbreviation. This is a matter of personal taste. Definitely, if you want to go that direction, some people really want to put the whole word river or creek there, that kind of thing. But definitely, something to keep in mind. There's also a question, could I stack the label? I've definitely done that before. If we're really short on space, I might say, like, this is the Anadir River. And I'd clean up those curves a little bit and angle some things better. But you get the idea. Absolutely. So there's some, there's a lot of good ideas going out here in the chat. And these are just some examples. But all of them are centered on this central concept. Let's make a strong relationship between the label and the thing, and that's consistent spacing. That's being close to the river. That's following the curve, but not going nuts and following every little tiny bend so that it interferes with legibility. It's about, not keeping things separated where we're floating on the road here. And one thing about that ascender and descender consistent spacing that I just thought about and forgot to mention, I talked about Colville is a little bit better on top because there's this nice baseline, even space, but that's also kind of one reason why, if we go way back here actually, I think these are second best, these center situations on point labels, because the spacing to the dot changes a little bit because of the ascenders and the descenders in the type. Look at the D in London. That ascender in the D is closer to the dot than the N is. The capital Q, the tail on that in Al-Qahira, gets a little bit too close to the star versus that. And, if I had a label that, was a different city, I'm just going to drop the Q there and pretend it was an I, even though that's not really the name of a place probably. That's a little bit more even. So it's about understanding why any of this stuff happens versus following anything I'm telling you in a rote fashion. That's the goal here. So there's a couple of questions about offsetting paths. Yeah, I to keep consistent spacing, my trick might be either to make the river stroke thicker, kind of like what we just did with the dots, or I might instead put the line down here and go to the character palette and do an offset path. That does, however, sometimes cause the kerning to get a little bit messy when you are on curves. So usually I just space it instead. I just actually physically move the label. But that's a great question. And there's a couple other questions here, but there's a few more things I want to talk about, so I'll loop back around to those if we got a little bit of time at the end. But it's great that you're all asking things and so engaged. I'm used to having like 20 people on my streams, and they're lovely people who show up, and they ask good questions, but I'm mildly overwhelmed by the quantity of content coming in, which is great. One other thing on line features. People always ask me, students always ask me when they're starting to label their maps, should I label it more than once, or do I need to? And there's usually no harm in doing so. I can't give you a rule about how far they should be spaced, which is the other question students will ask me. But think about it, the way you solve that problem is just think of what your reader's experience is going to be like. Their eye is going to drop in the middle here somewhere in the river when they're looking at the map, and they're just going to trace along for a while until they figure out where the name is. So think about how far do you want them to search, and what interferes potentially with their search. These are fine. I probably search this within a few seconds based on my field of vision. If there was a lot of other stuff on the map going on, there's, I don't know, if I just throw some random lines on here, stuff getting in the way. Oh, I didn't give those a stroke color. There you go. Where there's a whole bunch of other map stuff going on, that might get harder real fast, and especially if there's other rivers going on. So I might need more closely spaced labels. And also, this is where I see people run into trouble sometimes with labels where they might say Nile on one and then say river really far away. I think that can be a potential problem. I've seen this on topographic maps, for example. This is sometimes a solution people have for fitting labels into the river by spacing out the words. But I think, if your eye drops in here and you find the word river, well, now you know it's a river, but you don't know what it's called. It'd be nice to repeat the whole label and keep both parts very closely spaced so it's one obvious word that someone can apprehend all at once. That's important to me in the way that I do this. All right, that takes us to areas. Yep, I thought there was one other line thing, but no, that takes us to areas. So, yeah, areas. How do we create relationships between the area and the label? Well, we want our label to appear like it's influenced by the label. And what I mean for that, the label to be influenced by the area. And what I mean by that is, first off, if you can, try and fit your area inside, your label inside the area. I keep saying things backwards today. And that helps a lot just because, Lake Van, it's inside this shape. Probably related. But if you can, try and somehow mimic the shape a little bit. That's also what we're doing with rivers in the previous slides. We're trying to mimic the shape of the river as best we can. We want the label to seem like it's influenced by the geography, and that's what I'm trying to do here. And there's kind of two ways that we do that. Tracking and curving our label, potentially, depending on the shape. So here I've got one that uses both up here in the upper right, Lake Monona. You notice it's tracked out a little bit. There's spaces inserted between the characters in order to make it fill the space a little bit more. It's spreading out in the water. The width of the entire label is somehow mimicking the shape and influenced by it, and that builds a visual connection that as a map reader my brain starts to see these things resemble each other. They go together somehow. And then, yes, there's a question, was that an airplane in the background? I live near an airport. We'll also be lucky if jet fighters don't land during our presentation and if freight trains don't go by, because I am 30 yards from a railroad as well. I've been real lucky in my streams so far. There hasn't been a lot of background noise, but it's going to happen one of these days. So it's interesting that you can pick that up because it didn't sound too bad to me, but I'm also used to tuning them out, I think, mentally, because they happen all the time. So thanks for your patience with that. So Lake Monona is tracked out, spaced out there to mimic the shape, but it's also curved because the lake kind of, and this is just a fake lake that I drew, gave it a real name, and it's kind of hooked upward. So that again gives us a clue. Now Torch Lake over here isn't curved, but I could potentially curve it, somewhere along, I don't know, here maybe, but there's not a great way to mimic the shape of complicated things like this particular lake that I made up. Lots of lakes have really complex shapes, little bumps and nooks and crannies. You're not going to match everything, and that's fine. Just try and fill a good chunk of it as best you can. So this one is straight, kind of along a straight section of lake, and spaced out as best we can. It's easy to overdo these things too. This one I think is overcurved. This is like the river thing, or labeling roads and rivers, that we want to have a balance between legibility and finding our way to match the shape as best we can. And this one I think falls on the wrong side of that. It's definitely fitting this nice S-curve of the lake, but now the curvature of lake and where the space is doesn't quite fit. It's starting to get jumbled. So there's a request for fixing it live, and I'm actually going to do that. Very good. So thanks for asking. So I'm just going to alter that curve a little bit. I found here's a little bit of a shallower area that might be a little bit better. I would say, that's not too bad. Yeah, there we go. My rule for curve type too, I do a lot of it on my maps. If you've seen me present before or looked at my portfolio or anything I put on Twitter, I like to curve labels a lot, but in general, I only want things on simple, shallow curves as best I can. 2 points on these curves, and if you're working with Illustrator or other things that might let you add extra points, I usually stay away from those because those start to get too complicated. They'll cause the type frequently to jumble or to become less legible. So definitely, it's not an all-in-one rule. I mean, I've definitely put in more complicated paths before, but in very careful situations, I would say. So I would say simple curves are the best. There's a question about italics. This is something I get into debates about with colleagues like my mentor and friend Tanya about. I never absorbed I'm sure someone taught me at some point. I never absorbed rules about italics for water features or for certain water features and not. I personally think that's a stylistic preference. So I don't have any guidance one way or the other. Sometimes I use them, sometimes I don't, or sometimes I put the rivers in italic and the lakes not, or vice versa. I'm definitely not consistent, and there might be reasons for that people want to do it that way, but it's not something I have specific advice on. But it's a good thing to think about. It's a good question, absolutely. And the last thing here is that overtracking. You want to fill the space, you want to fit it well, but you can overdo that. This thing looks like it's going to spill out of the water, and that could be a problem. I don't want it's that tension thing. It's like balance. It's almost also like my brain is assigning weight and movement to these static, flat things. So if this feels like it's too tight and it's going to fall out, so I would say the spacing should be, set your tracking so that the space between the edge and the label is no worse. It is no smaller than the space between any individual characters. So I probably, tone that tracking down some there. I think that looks a little bit better. So don't overdo it, definitely. A couple of examples here of this not playing out quite right in the real world. This is just some from my phone, Google Maps, a couple years ago. I pieced together a few screenshots from it. Google is trying to do some of this lake labeling too, and they did a pretty good job on Lake Monona. Lake Mendota up here, maybe not as good, but that brings up the point that this stuff is hard, and it's very hard to teach computers to do. All of these guidelines I'm giving you, imagine how difficult it is to do that programmatically. It's really tough. And so this is why I was taught, and my mentors and instructors always taught me, and I think is still true today, the best labels are placed by hand. And I know that's not always an option for people, and this is not to slight those who do automated labeling, either who create the automated labeling systems or those who work with them because that's just sort of in their workflow. But those systems are not quite caught up to the complexities of human labeling. That's a really difficult thing to do, and how does it make the decisions that I'm suggesting to, fit the shape of a really complicated lake in a way that looks good? And imagine you've got a zillion other labels floating around on your map and it's getting really complex. How do you do that? So it's not a task I envy, those who have to program these kind of systems. But right now, I label all my maps by hand because I think that gives you the best look. And it's going to be a while, I still think, based on that complexity, before automated solutions catch up. So just a piece of advice. If you can do it by hand, definitely do it, although it does take a lot longer. But that's my favorite part, so I don't mind. A little example, part of a map that I made as a student in my intro cartography class. One thing that can potentially go wrong in your labels, I just talked about tracking. There's lots that I would change about this because this was a long time ago. But you notice this Russia label over here, RUSSIA. That's really spaced out. Huge tracking. And the reason for that is because I was told, I should make my labels fit the space, and Russia's a big space, and it's a short word, so I got to really spread it out. This is, again, that tension between trying to make our label have a good visual relationship, but also making it legible. And at this point, these characters are spaced out so much that they don't look like words anymore. Or, my eye finds an S on the map, and I don't even realize that there's an I over here or an S that goes with it. So definitely don't overdo this kind of thing. All of these guidelines are very flexible. Absolutely. Amy's asking, did we all do Europe in intro cart? I did, and for a few years after, that was a big one. We switched it later on to Africa, and I think now our classes might even rotate between a few different continents over time. But there's definitely, I wanted to I developed an Africa version of this exercise for my students so they could learn about some other places of the world as well, and also so they couldn't copy people who did Europe in the past. Had that happen a couple of times, unfortunately. So in any case, this is my example, and my TA at the time pointed out to me and to the entire class in a good-natured way not to Huffmanize your labels, not to way overtrack them. That was his description of it. So it was a lesson I learned very early on to not overdo it. What happens if you can't put your label inside? Well, here I've got a whole bunch of area features, and I was able to fit the St. Lawrence Island Polinia or the Andriovsky Wilderness inside, but I couldn't do that everywhere. And usually the guidance there is, put it next to it. Pretend it's a point feature. Kind of put it off into the corner if you can, that kind of thing. That's a perfectly reasonable solution. It's still a strong relationship between the label and the thing that you're labeling. You could also try putting it on top. I had to do that over here with East Norton Sound. I think that's not as good, but it was also the only place I had space for it, unfortunately. There was too many other labels around. So, I think it looks kind of awkward falling off the polygons some places and not. But, it's the best we can do. So Will Score is asking, do my students use Illustrator? If any of them used Inkscape? We teach Illustrator workflow at the University of Wisconsin. I do tell them Inkscape exists. I'm not really, I'm not very experienced with it. I've poked around briefly, but so I don't feel like I can support them in that. So it's I also tell them they can use QGIS if they want to. We teach ArcMap. And I just sort of explained, look, you might be a little more on your own with this software because, your TA's experience and my experience might not be enough to help you through these things. But if you want to go that direction, please know about these alternatives. Absolutely. So that's a great question. And I know see people are in there talking about Inkscape as an alternative to Illustrator. And I know some people who use that. I just haven't gotten into it yet, but it's definitely on my list of things to dig into at some point. So I talked here about this East Norton sound label as being unideal, and that's kind of the last point I want to bring a lot of this around to. Real labeling situations are unideal. There's all kinds of stuff in the way, and I'm giving you guidelines and my theory behind the guidelines, but then I have to break that all the time. These aren't rules by any means. So Dearborn Heights, boy, it's in the center there. I wish it was off to in the corner position. That'd be nicer. Can't do it. No space for it. The River Rouge, it's under, and it's kind of a little bit packed into a tight corner there. Be nice if it were on top of the river. No space for it. Ford Lake doesn't fit in. But I still try and follow the general idea of how do I create at least as strong of a geometric relationship as I can. And so notice Ford Lake, I didn't label it just off to the side. I kind of tucked it into this little almost notch in the shape of the lake so that there's a consistent amount of empty space, as best we can, between the label and the edge of the lake all throughout there. They almost look like they're interlocking puzzle pieces. With the fact that the label is bumping up and down, so it's not perfect. So I'm going for those kind of things. That creates a real strong, obvious relationship and adds some elegance to things. So those are the kind of details that I think make a big difference in your map. Paying attention to how we make this as clear as possible. So a couple last things to share with you. First off, some of you may have seen this already, but I put together a little movie recently that I posted on Twitter, last month, and it's on my YouTube page, about how I applied this idea in a few other situations beyond the simple points, lines, and polygons, because most mapping situations don't fit into neat boxes. So I just want to go through this a little bit here. So here I have to label a point, just a spit of land going out into a lake. You think, well, that's not really a line feature or geometric point feature or an area feature. How would we do that? And at the time, I was looking at this as thinking, like, it kind of follows a curve. So what if I just extend that curve and put the label on it? And now there's a relationship between the label and the point. It seems like it's flowing out of it. The curvature of the land continues in the label. That creates a strong geometry connection between them. I see there's a question of commenting on curved text for point features. I'm definitely going to get to that. That's my last point. That's one of my favorite things to talk about. So we'll get to that in a minute. So that's my thing for point detour there. Another couple of examples. Here I had to label a map with a bunch of building complexes in China in a 19th century, not 19th century. It was older than that. Now I can't remember when it was. A few hundred years ago. Imperial retreat. So these look okay. This is groups of buildings. The labels are off to the side, and that's fine. It's obvious what it is, but I thought, can I make stronger relationships geometrically between these? So notice there's sort of a flat edge here to the building. So what if I take that and play the flat edge of the type right off of it? Right, so now there's spacing. Same thing over here. We've got this corner of the complex. So what if I play off the corner of the labels? So just a little bit better. It was still pretty good before, but I like how it looks now. And then finally, here I've got a passage, just a body of water spanning, that takes you between a couple of islands in Michigan and the mainland in Lake Michigan. So here I thought, well, what is the shape of this passage? Well, let's look at the area halfway between the islands and the curve that it follows, and let's make that label flow out and follow the shape of the passage through the water. So that's what I'm talking about. All of this is driven by this idea of geometric relationships. And so I just wanted to kind of share that with you, especially because that video took a long time to make, so I want to get as much mileage out of it as possible. And the last thing that I want to mention is not about fundamentals of label positioning, but it is about a comment someone had, and it's something I wanted to share because it's an idea I came up with recently that I want to throw out there for you to consider. And that has to do with these curved labels. So we got this one for Melvindale or Wayne, and right now I'm doing this to dodge them out of the way of stuff. When you get really dense labeling situations, we've got to find places to put stuff, and sometimes we can't even put our label on a straight line. And so the question is, should we do it on an angle, or should we do some sort of curvature to it? So I'm going to go up back here to a previous one where I've got some editable labels here, because that's just a screenshot here. So what if I had Luando like this, and for some reason there was other stuff around? I could put it at an angle like that, or instead I could put it on a curve. Just copy that over here and shallow my curve out and rotate it. And so the question is, why is one better than the other? And I've seen people present, and they've talked about, they like the curve better, and I certainly aesthetically like the curve better, but why is that? And in a previous stream I talked about this idea of, the curve looks more intentional. Certainly it's less haphazard and accidental. Like, this thing was definitely planned out. And there's, again, that idea of respect for our readers by making things look purposeful and intentional. But there's another thing that I came up with recently that I think is valuable as a way to think about how this works. And it has to do with ballistic trajectories. Another thing our eye and brain are used to thinking about. Somebody tosses a ball at you back when we could all go outside and you were going to catch it. It follows a ballistic arc. And your brain doesn't have to know any of the physics behind how that works and the equations that I learned in high school about the path it takes. It just understands trajectories like this. And I think that's kind of what goes on with this label. It has a ballistic certainty to it. It feels organic, and it's definitely coming in for a landing at this point. It flows more naturally, and it's clearer, I think. Because of that curvature, it looks like it's definitely aiming for something. So that's one reason why I go with it, and I really like this phrase that came up the other day, ballistic certainty to curved labels. So I'm going to float that idea out there for you, and you can take or use it or leave it as you like, but I'm curious what people think about that. And meanwhile, that's my main thread of things, so I'm going to look at the comments here and see if we got some other questions that we can cover in our last few minutes, or you're welcome to duck off and get coffee or a sandwich or something. So are there rules for font sizes used in maps? That kind of depends a lot on your print quality, if you're printing, or what kind of screen size. I often trial things, but if I'm going to print something out, I usually will probably not go smaller than about 6 or 7, definitely. But what it really is, it depends also on the distance that people are going to be reading from. So it'd be nice if we could specify type sizes in the solid angle that the text subtends in the retina, but that's not really practical. But that's, I remember, talking to somebody once, and he was working on a project that was going to be a floor map. So we had to look at, well, what if we print out tests at certain sizes of type, set it on the floor, and look down and see, can we read that based on an average person's height? Yeah, so it's definitely going to be situational. Unfortunately, that's always true in most mapping things. So there are questions about leader lines and callouts. I do use them. I think actually I probably used them in that example from my intro class. Yeah, I used some ones here. Probably nowadays I would do curves if I could in a lot of these situations. It would have been, a little bit better to make those labels flow around. But I've definitely used them here and there. I think they're a last resort, because the thing is, where you see the word, when your eye first catches the word, the name, that's when you think about the place. But you're thinking about the place when you're not looking at the place, when the dot is over here. So it's nice to keep those things as close as possible. And I think if you can curve things or do some other trick, or just a lot of shuffling around to make things work, I think that's better if you can. But lead lines are sometimes an option. And, I could give a whole separate lecture, because I go on for like an hour with my students about what to do when things aren't ideal, like, knocking things out for labels, moving them around, changing colors, adding lead lines, adding inset maps if you really have to. You got stuff you got to cram in there. There's definitely a lot of other options. And here I'm mostly talking about sort of the ideals, what we want to kind of aim for if we definitely can. Malcolm Cool asks, got any tips for a map which has multiple clusters of features but where they're far apart? Yeah, so that's always a challenge. You could inset them if you really can't fit all the labels, but you could also think about breaking the geography even, and doing more of a cartogram, where you're kind of inflating one area and shrinking others. I've done this kind of thing in the past before. So if I go to my portfolio here, I've got a map that I did for, it didn't end up getting picked up, but I've got a map that I did for an airline for their flight map. And this is a heavily distorted view of the world. The Americas are really squished in a horizontal fashion. The Middle East is significantly expanded. And that was all to fit all those point features in and clearly label them all so we could see where all the destinations that this airline went to. So if you can get away with that, I think we don't do that enough as cartographers, and it's kind of fun to do. I know that it's not good for every mapping situation, and sometimes you got to really have all that geometry, all the placements on the Earth perfectly, in line with your projection. But it's an option to, or even just imagine like dropping a sort of magnifying lens over an area and put your inset directly over the points, the cluster of features, and then have another magnifier directly over another one. Could be an option. Let's see what else here. Serif for natural and sans serif for cultural, vice versa. I was taught serif for natural features and sans for cultural. I don't follow that most of the time. I think that there might be some rationale behind it, the flowiness of serifs and natural things, but what I instead do is think about if I'm going to use two typefaces, which I don't always, but sometimes if I'm going to have a big map that's going to have a lot of stuff, two typefaces, one is serif, one is sans, and think about sort of two categories of map things. So, because that serif, sans serif distinction is visually very strong. So, in this atlas that I worked on, I don't know what you can see, might be some, here's a smaller map. I did actually, there's not a lot of these labels on here, so this is not a great example, but I did all of the base map features in a serif and all of the thematic features in a sans to separate them out visually, because I wanted people to to make that separation, but I didn't really want to focus on human-made versus natural. I mean, all of the stuff in this atlas pretty much is, all the serif stuff, some of that's human and some of the sans stuff is natural. So it's not a natural thing. It's just two big classes of mapped content separation. Did I draw the continent outlines myself for that airline map? I did. There's a blog post. So if you go to somethingaboutmaps.com, you head over to my portfolio, there's a blog post about it, and you can see kind of how it came to be. And there's some, I started with something a little bit more normal on a Gauss stereographic projection, and spent a lot of time doing things like this. Like, let's cut part of South America out and just move it up or move it down to make it take up a little less space. So there was a lot of that, and then I redrew all the line work on top of that in these very simplified shapes, which hides all the damage I did to the geography. Let's see, what else do we have here? See if I missed anything. There's so many questions coming in. Some talk about map sizes, some suggestion of 7-point minimum or font size in relation to paper map. Yeah, I think it's also going to depend, not only on the distance to the map, it's going to depend on the typeface. Some typefaces hold up better at small sizes, especially if they have big, thick strokes, or if they don't have a lot of thin contrast, or if there's a bold, they might hold up at a smaller point size. Point size isn't everything. It's a good starting point. And it's also going to depend on your print quality as well. I've been messing around for fun with making fake half-toned maps, and you might have seen my last live stream on that, some of you. But, a lot of printing done with little dots. And depending on your map, you can see here maybe a little bit, I don't know if I zoom in on Wisconsin, right? You can see it's made up of, this is just a Photoshop fakery, but, as depending on your print quality and how big your dots are, small text is going to start to break up a lot, depending on its lightness as well. The more ink it uses, the better this is going to be. But also the type size and the print quality. So that's another thing to consider. There's a lot of variables, definitely, to consider. Amy is asking me about halos versus knockouts. I like knockouts usually best. I like to, if you're not familiar with those terms, I've got some tutorials also linked through my blog about, for example, type knockouts in Illustrator. And knockouts are where we hide parts of the feature. So you can see here, I've hidden parts of my coastline under this label to help it just be a little bit more legible. Instead, I could have put maybe some sort of colored halo behind this label, white or blue or something like that. I like to just make features go away because a halo draws a little bit of attention to itself. You know it's there. And I like things where you don't know they're there. But that's a personal preference. And I've also got, there are times when I use halos where knockouts aren't as practical because, I can knock out vector features easily. I can turn off bits of these water lines. But at the same time, I've got a halo tutorial because there are times when you're labeling a raster and you just need to have like something behind the text like this to make that legible. And I can't just get rid of my underlying area. So that's a great question. So there's so much to talk about with typography, and this is why I go on for 4 odd hours. It's the biggest topic time-wise that I cover in my intro cartography course when I adjunct from time to time, because I think that typography, not only is it's my favorite part of cartography, but I think good typography is one of the make or break things in a map. It's conveying a lot of critical information. It's easy to do in a way that looks a little bit sloppy, so we want to mind those details and pay attention to all the little things. It controls so much of the information that people understand from the map, where they're at, what the numbers are saying. So it's worth paying a huge amount of attention to. Unfortunately, there's not always a lot of easy answers about, what's your type size? Well, it kind of depends. Should I use italics or not? Well, some people have hard and fast rules about that, and I don't. So there's definitely a lot of those things going on. We got 3 or 4 minutes left. If you want to duck out and get ready for the next presentation, I'll just point to the schedule here. Looks like we're coming up on 1 o'clock New York time, noon for me. If you go to bit.ly/map stuff, and I typed bit.ly wrong there, you'll get to the schedule here. Looks like we've got Alberto Nieto coming up, who's going to be wrangling data, visualizing patterns with Python and GIS, and Dylan Moriarty is going to be talking about textures and patterns. So there's some fun stuff coming up, and I hope you'll stick around for all this. And so, yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to join me. I'm going to leave off here just to give you a little bit of transition time. It's something I hadn't thought about when I was scheduling people. I should have asked presenters to maybe give the audience a little bit to decide what they want to do next, or go to the bathroom before the next presentation. And in the meanwhile, as you trickle out, I'll answer a couple last questions. Dave Miller asks me, great presentation, what's your favorite software for map production? It's favored for me because it's how I was raised, as it were. I do like an ArcMap or a QGIS to Illustrator. That at University of Wisconsin, I was taught to do ArcMap to Illustrator, and that's what I teach there when I adjunct and what the other instructors still teach. I definitely do a lot more QGIS stuff now as well. I've been getting into that over the past several years. Illustrator is my go-to. I don't think these things are inherently superior. I think they're just different. I've seen people do great mapping work with other workflows. This is the one that I know, and I'm always trying to expand that skill set because they're different. I can do different things in Illustrator that some people can't do in other software, and they can do stuff that I can't. So it's just it lends itself well to the style I like, though, the real slow manual cartography kind of style. And people are saying thanks, and I just want to say, well, thanks to you for showing up. There was just an acre of you folks. There was like 400 people at one point, which is crazy. That's the biggest room I've talked to, I'm pretty sure. I do these streams again. I do these streams from time to time. Did 4 last year, did 1 last month. So if you want to follow around on Twitter, you can find that from somethingaboutmaps.com. Find my Twitter handle, and I will announce future live streams if I continue doing these from time to time. And I hope I'll see you there. But other than that, thanks for joining me, and I'll catch you in the chat in some of these other live streams today. I'll talk to you later.